It's a great pleasure to be here for this program, which I was very excited about being able to attend, and I'm now additionally excited about being able to help moderate it. We have 3 or 4 wonderful panelists. 3 of them are here, and we're very hopeful that the 4th will make it. And let me introduce them now so that as they come up, they can just do their presentations. Our first speaker is Lubna Mrei. I've butchered it, and I can't help that. I'm sorry. We've practiced 5 times, and I still don't have it absolutely right. Lubna is about to become a graduate student at New York University. She is herself a Syrian refugee with a very interesting story, which she will recount to you. The second speaker will be Susan Weiss. Susan is actually the organizer of this whole program. She is a freelance photographer who, in a second career, decided to use photography as a means of exploring many interests of hers around the world. And she will explain to you how she got involved in this project and wound up with the photographic journey that she's going to take you on. Our third speaker, if she arrives on time, is Laurie Stravand. Laurie is the community director for the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigration, based in Vermont. That's a non-governmental organization working closely with the U.S. government and with the refugee community to facilitate the settlement of refugees in this country, and particularly in Laurie's case in this state. And finally, we're very lucky to have with us Christopher Louras. Chris is the mayor of Rutland, has been since 2007, and he will talk about why Rutland is particularly eager, why he as mayor is particularly eager to welcome refugees to his city. So with no further ado, let me ask Lubna to come and get us started on our journey.
Hello everyone, it's so overwhelming. So before I start talking about myself and about my experience, I will take a couple of minutes to explain or to give you a brief explanation of the history of the Syrian conflict. I know that many of you know that there's something bad going on there, but what is really going on? So as a start, we have a president called Bashar al-Assad, who became the president in the 2000 when his father died. So this person was not elected. And his father, Hafez al-Assad, became the president after he organized a coup against his friends in 1971. So basically, the country has been ruled by the same family since the 70s, which is almost 40 years. So I don't think we have enough time today to explain to you the horrible things that this government did to its own people, but I can summarize it by telling you that I literally grew up believing that the walls have ears, that everything you say is recorded by the government. So therefore, you're not allowed to criticize the government, and you're not allowed to talk about politics or current affairs. So the Syrian people basically had every reason to join the Arab Spring in 2011, and this is what happened. In 2011, March 15, sorry, this is shaking. Maybe I'm shaking. So in 2011, March 15, the people decided to do the uprising, and they went into the streets, calling for democracy, justice, and fair elections. Well, apparently the government was not happy with that, and they started to shoot people. So for we can say like 6 to 7 months, the demonstrations were peaceful. So how it became armed is when the people from the government, police forces, and army soldiers defected from the government and joined the uprising. So those people defected and they started the Free Syrian Army, which the main goal of the Free Syrian Army was to protect those demonstrations. So now I'm here trying to brief you on like just the past 5 years, which is kind of more complicated than this, but still, many people joined the Free Syrian Army, and it became popular in a way, and so when the Free Syrian Army became bigger, it started to do clashes against the government, and this is when they started to take control over areas. And again, apparently the government was not really pleased with that, and they started to punish those places that gave public support to the Free Syrian Army, which is the armed opposition. And they used every possible weapon, including the chemical attacks that almost killed 900 people in less than half an hour in eastern Ghouta, which is close to Damascus. Again, and this has all happened while just like the whole international community was watching. Again, this is really complicated. I cannot really explain everything in 5 minutes, but still, and this is how the situation became more chaotic, and this is when the people started to flee the country. So often people ask me how it became, what's the right word? Radical. It's not that, like I know how the media tries to portray the Syrian uprising, which is like ISIS against the government, but the truth is that well, many factors affected this radicalization. Is that true? Yeah. First of all, Turkey opened the borders, and so we had many foreign fighters coming to join the conflict. And the president, Bashar al-Assad, released all the radicals people from the jails to hijack the uprising. And also we have like the Gulf area money. So, yeah, this is how the situation became bad. And so now probably you're asking yourself, who's this person? Going back to me, I'm a Syrian activist and a photographer. I joined the Syrian uprising in the beginning of 2011, and I was a media activist. And you're seeing my photos there. So what a media activist means. So the government really banned every journalist from coming and covering the uprising. So it was our own responsibility to shoot and to document and to show the people what's going on in the country. And in 2012, I lost a family member, like all Syrian families, which was my mom, and she was kidnapped and killed by the secret forces of the government. I don't really want to go there. It's too personal and so hurtful. What else? Long story short, I worked on my photography skills, and in a year I got an offer from Reuters, and I was covering the conflict for them, and then I applied for a fellowship for photography and human rights here in the US, and this is how I got here. This is how I got a visa stamped on my passport. And since then I studied for a year, and then I worked for the Atlantic Media for a year, and now I'm going to school, thank God. And I think that's it, but now, after spending 2 years in this country, what really hurts me that how the media portrays Syria and the Syrian conflict. Like now I look at my country and it becomes to me just like this faceless struggle. Just like when you think about the Syria and its refugee crisis, the only thing you remember just like a photo or just like poor people taking the boat across the sea. But what I want to say here that, yes, I know that probably many of you are against refugees to coming here, which is understandable. I was like you in 2003 when the Iraqi refugees came to my country, and I had no idea what they were doing here, and I was scared because it's very hard for you to understand what it's like to be a refugee if you are not one. And And what I want to say, just like imagine yourself just like losing everything and losing everything you've built for you and your family, and are forced to flee your country and starting over in a new country. Just give those people a chance. They are not, as the media is trying to portray them, we are not radical. We are not fleeing poverty. We are educated. We had lawyers fleeing the country. We had doctors. Many of those people that you see in the pictures on the boats, they used to have factories at some point, but they just had to flee, and they didn't want their children to be a poster kid for Amnesty or Human Rights Watch. They needed a decent life, and this is what they are trying to achieve in this country. I think I talked too much, so thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for having me here. Vermont is really beautiful. And thank you.
So thank you, Lubna. I just actually met Lubna 2 weeks ago at the Aspen Ideas Festival that I attended with my husband, and we were sitting in on a panel discussion on Syria and Syrian refugees, and she was there, and I said, she has got to come here, and we exchanged information, and here she is. So thank you, Lubna, and thank you, the mayor, and Lori, if she shows up, and to Gloria for allowing us to do this program. I had the opportunity to go to Lesbos actually in November of 2015, and I decided not to go because I wasn't sure if I could take photographs, and I felt like if I couldn't take photographs, it would be really frustrating, and my friends who were going were just going to basically show up on the beach and volunteer, which in California some people were doing. And I said, but you know what, get me the information, the contact person, and then when you come back, I'll try and reach out to them and see if I can go. And when they came back, you know, they were really inspired about doing the work there, and I contacted the group that they ended up hooking up with, which is IsraAid, which is an Israeli NGO that does humanitarian and disaster relief actually all over the globe, but they're also in Lesbos and then ultimately in Berlin. And I contacted them, asked if I could come work with them and take photographs by working with them, and they said sure. So that's how my story began, and then I went in February of this year. So this starts in February when I went to Lesbos, and actually my husband came with me, and he was great. I don't know if I could have done it without him. But IsraAid is a disaster relief organization that is based on the beaches and in the camps. And at the time we went, this was the refugee trail in Europe, coming out of the Middle East, crossing in Turkey over to Lesbos and several other islands, because it's around 6 to 10 miles, depending on where you cross, over into Greece, which is Europe. So they would get to Turkey by any means they could. If they had money, they would fly or they would drive. People from Afghanistan are walking to Turkey. And when they get to Turkey, sometimes they spend months, a year or so in a camp, or if they have enough money, they can pay smugglers. They come sooner than that, and they can make the crossing. A crossing costs approximately $2,000 per person. And so in order to even get to that point, you have had to pay your way to get to Turkey, pay for the crossing, and then pay for your travels going north into Europe. And the goal is to get to Northern Europe, primarily Germany and Sweden, because they are offering the best package for refugees in terms of funding support, housing, education, language training, and health services. So their goal was to get to Northern Europe, which is the wealthier countries. So this is the map of the original refugee trail as of February. This is a map of the camps, the refugee camps that are now currently throughout Europe. And maybe 4 million people have left Syria and the Middle East at this time and are now residing somewhere in Europe. So the camps are actually everywhere. This is a map of the Schengen countries, and this is critical because the Schengen agreement allows free passage throughout Europe without a visa. And Lori is here. So if you are in Europe, you can travel from country to country within this agreed surroundings without any documentation. So what was happening is, as the refugees were coming into Greece, then they would try and get north. As soon as they would get into one of these countries, they could have free passage to any country that they wanted to go to. Well, as you saw in the news, they were crowding into Hungary, Macedonia, and many other countries. And Hungary was the first one to close its borders. Then Macedonia was the next one. And then the week of February 20th, they signed an official agreement saying that all the borders were closed and they could not travel out of Greece and go north. So coincidentally, this is the week that I was in Greece. So it became a very critical story because the refugees who were arriving the week we were there, hopeful that they were going to get north, actually were stopped at the border. In the first few days that we were there, those were able to pass through into Macedonia and never made it to Germany or any other country, and the others stayed in Greece in camps along the border, in Idomeni, which is a common name you probably heard of in the news, where they were staying. There was a large camp right on the Greek-German border, Greek-Macedonia border. So this is Israel sitting and literally watching for boats. So the boats generally left at night in darkness and cover of darkness, because there were some patrols along the Aegean Sea, whether they were UN boats, Greek boats, or Turkish boats, picking up the refugees and either sending them back to Turkey or putting them in a camp in Greece. So ideally, people wanted to avoid those boats and get to land and on the Greek side and move forward. So because of international human trafficking laws, you are not allowed to in any way encourage the boats to land. So that means signage, picking them up in the water with boats. You know, the logical thing was you just go and get them and bring them over, but you were not allowed to do anything. And this was being monitored by the Greek police that we saw on the beaches, and also UNHRC, the UN Refugee Organization. And so they were very careful to not break any rules, the NGOs that were there. And there were several NGOs that we saw. There were the Israelis, we saw Dutch, we saw Spanish, and we saw people from Sweden. And they're all working in various capacities on the beach. The Israelis were actually Arabic speaking. They were mostly from northern Israel, near the Syrian border. And they were not just Jewish Israelis. There were Muslims, Druze, and also Christians, but they all were fluent in Arabic. So they were really welcome because they were able to communicate with the people. No one else spoke Arabic. So they would literally sit out on the beach waiting for the boats. And when they could see a boat in the distance, which by the crossing, which is like 4 to 6 hours in good weather, it was already sunrise and you could see the boats coming in. They would try and direct them to a safe spot to land, using this kind of a system or just waving their hands, but they were not allowed to do anything, quote, official to encourage them to land. And they weren't allowed to even bring the boats in. They had to wait until the boats were about 2 feet off the shore, which made them officially on foreign soil, and then they could help bring them in. So here they are standing. You can see a boat way in the distance, trying to encourage it to go to a safe spot. Often the boats sort of drifted and ended up on rocks or a place where they couldn't reach them, and they'd have to climb over rocks and hills to get into safe, flat territory. So it was a perilous situation. And then you've all seen these pictures of the boats coming in. And, you know, it was very emotional. My first experience in seeing a boat, and I was there to photograph, and what they do is they line you up to receive the people coming out of the boats. And they first bring off the babies, then they bring the young children, then the women, and then the men are the last. And on my first experience, it was so emotional, I just said, I can't do this. I can't take photographs. I have to help. And I lined up, and they hand you a baby, and then you wait maybe 15, 20 minutes till the mother comes out. And she finds you, and it's kind of chaotic because they're, very traumatized when they land, and all the NGOs who are there trying to help them, until you connect with the parents and hand the baby over. It's a very emotional experience. So what they do on the beach is they do triage. A lot of the people have hypothermia because the water was very cold in February. They wrap their feet, especially the children, up in these metallic blankets to warm their feet. They give them fresh clothing. A lot of people were sending clothes over, so they had a huge supply of clothing, especially for the kids, socks, pants, shoes. And then they help them psychologically. So this is a woman who came off the boat, and it's very emotional. Like I said, a lot of them had a lot of trauma where they were coming from, and this is an Israel Aid psychosocial worker helping this particular woman right on the beach. Then from the beach, they're shuttled to the main camp, which is called Moriah, where all the refugees stayed for approximately 3 days to process their paperwork. So in total, their stay in Lesbos was about 3 to 4 days from arriving to leaving. And then this is what the beach looks like after they board the bus. Obviously, there's a lot of trash, and the Greek people were responsible for cleaning up the beach afterwards. And the life jackets, they would truck away the life jackets, they would destroy the boats, they would rip up the boats because they don't want them reused. The life jackets were actually fake. There's some factory on the Turkish side that is just churning these out. It's just foam with orange fabric over it. So the life jackets, in effect, did not work. And they would destroy the life jackets. And actually, Ai Weiwei, the artist, did a couple art pieces, installations using the life jackets. The Chinese artist. I don't know if you've seen that. Okay. So this is in the camps. This is a shot. So they moved to this large camp called Moriah and lived in tents while they were processing their paperwork. And my intent originally in going over was to not show them in distress behind the fences and in trauma. I wanted to show them as individuals, just like everybody else. They are part of society. And I wanted to show them in an uplifting way. So my goal going over, and I checked with Israel to see if I could do this, if I could take formal portraits of the people that I did meet. So this is now a mix of those photos plus the scene in that particular camp. So there were outside commercial services like this food tent, where those who had money could actually purchase more food. And then this is a medical camp run by MSF, the French, Doctors Without Borders. They had a camp in a separate location. This is a little kid that was in the camp. 2 women. So I was shooting all around the camp, and this is a group of Pakistani men. Another shot of the Doctors Without Borders camp. A tent shot. So they had facilities there when they were staying there to do laundry, to bathe, to take personal care of themselves, feed their families. This is the phone charging booth, because everyone had a cell phone and maybe even a computer. They were only allowed to carry what they could carry on their bodies, no luggage. And what would happen is if they got into the boat in the raft with the luggage, the smugglers would throw it overboard, because they would overcrowd the boats, which would normally hold 20 to 30 people, with 70 to 80, 90 people. So there was absolutely no room to carry anything other than what you could carry in a small backpack. So after they registered and got their paperwork to travel on, they would go to the port where they would board this ferry to move north to Athens and then make their way on their own to the border. Some people paid for taxi rides, some had drivers, depending on how much money they had. Some people walked. You saw images last summer of people walking throughout Europe. And then these shots were all taken at the port. And they would line up, they would get there early. Let's say the boat left at 7 at night. They would start arriving in the afternoon and lining up. It was very organized, very civil. You couldn't have asked for any better planning and behavior. These people were just very law-abiding, wonderful people waiting their turn to board this boat. So these are all people that were at the port. Israel Aid would set up tables at the port to give them food for the passage. The boat ride was about 6 to 7 hours at night, and again, they had no food with them, so they would give them sandwiches or other kinds of food that they would distribute at the port. Right. So I am in contact with several of the refugees. One family that got to as far as Macedonia, and then they were not allowed to proceed because of the change in the Schengen rules. And this family sent me photos of the situation there. So this was in March. And the weather was terrible. They're living in this temporary spot. It isn't even a camp. They were out in a field. And it was really dismal. And it was a lovely family that I had met at the port. I had cards with my name and contact information that I was handing out to people and saying, you know, please let me know what happens to you. And he reached out. And so then in April, I went to Berlin. Israel Aid started working in Berlin with the refugees there. And that's a whole different story, because Germany took in about 1 million refugees, and they were inundated. They didn't know how to deal with it. It was so many people so quickly. So they were repurposing a lot of old buildings, including the Tempelhof Airport, which was the former Nazi airport in Berlin. And they just went in and built rows and rows of bunk beds and dressers to accommodate all the refugees. So the one problem is that the women, the married couples, they were trying to take as many people as possible. And the women who were in families, they had to split up so that they couldn't justify giving one little room or space to a family when they could put 3 men in there instead of a couple. So they were splitting up in Germany, the men and the women, the families, so that they could take in more people and have more refugees being housed. This is another refugee situation in Berlin, and this is just a dome. There's no windows, there was no heat. The days that I was there, it was very hot, and that was in April, so I can't imagine when it's like this summer. Here's a couple taking language lessons. They have drawing for the kids. So the Germans are very organized, and they're providing health care, education, some job training. And then I met this gentleman, Danny, who's from Syria, and he came from a pro-Assad town, and he was being recruited for the army. And he told me if he didn't go, he would have been killed. So he left, and he made his way to Berlin about 6 months before I got there. So he'd been living in one of the shelters for 6 months, not able to find a job. He had already received his papers as refugee status, but he couldn't find a job. He couldn't find housing. The Germans at this point were already getting very concerned, and it was very hard for him to find a life outside of the shelter. This is his ID card. So in German efficiency, their documentation is all numbers. They're not referred to as people. This is his wristband that he had to wear. And he told me that if he lost it, it was one of those flimsy wristbands, if he lost 3 of them, he was sent back home. So he was very careful to keep it. This is his paperwork that he had to carry with him at all times. And this is in that bubble shelter. So these are just some charts of countries that are taking refugees and how many they're taking. And you can see that most of them are from Syria. And that's it. That's my part of the story. And now Lori is here. We'll take over. Thank you.
So I'd like to thank you all for being here on behalf of VRP staff, our clients, and our volunteers. Vermont Refugee Resettlement Program was founded in 1980. That is the year that the Refugee Act was passed by Congress. It has been an incredible resource for people in the state to take action, to take care of human rights for people resettling in our state. Since 1989, we've resettled over 7,000 people here. It has been a nonpartisan program, refugee resettlement in the U.S. it's been a bit of a shock to all of us who work to resettle refugees that since the Syrian crisis, there's been so much debate about how to take care of this humanitarian crisis. So the response of Vermonters has been to reach out to us and offer their support. It's been overwhelming. People have called, written, visited, invited us throughout the state. We are very much feeling grateful for being in Vermont. That is not the same atmosphere that there are in some other states in the U.S. We started to hear from people that they would be very interested to have refugees resettled in their community. And when the president and the State Department decided that in fiscal year 17 they would increase the number of refugees coming to the U.S. and start to invite Syrians, we started to look to see how we could increase our capacity. There were many communities that showed an interest. As we're looking at the state, we started to take note of Rutland, which is the third largest city in Vermont and has the infrastructure of a city, but the community of a town. While we were considering Rutland, along with other sites, Mayor Loris from the city of Rutland reached out to us because he saw that Rutland had the capacity to take a leadership role in the state. And also he understood that refugees being resettled in his community would be a tremendous economic benefit, bring economic vitality to the city. So we started talking to stakeholders in the community. We were talking to healthcare providers. We were talking to educators. We were talking to business leaders. And it looked like it was worth doing more investigation. As we assessed the housing, the public transportation, the healthcare system, the education system, the social service providers, and the support within community groups and individuals, it was clear that Rutland could be a wonderful place for refugees to come. We had a capacity meeting at the end of May where we brought stakeholders together. We determined that based on what everybody was saying, that it was reasonable to expect that we could resettle 100 refugees in Rutland over the course of a year. So in the end of May, we submitted an application to the State Department to begin resettling refugees there and set up a sub-site. So our main site is in Colchester, which is in the Burlington area. We can resettle refugees within 50-mile radius of that without making any separate application. But Rutland is just that much farther away that we had to make that application. We expect to hear in a couple of months whether the State Department approves that application. Once we know whether we have approval, then we can start to look at setting up a program starting in the federal fiscal year 17, which starts October 1st. That means we're going to be looking for staff that have language skills. So we're going to be looking for a case manager, employment counselor, reach-up case manager, medical case manager. Ideally, we can do some fundraising and maybe have a volunteer coordinator there as well. We do not know when we will start to receive refugees in Rutland. The way the process works is we're a field office. of USCRI. There are 9 organizations that have a contract with the State Department to resettle refugees. So the State Department is bringing refugees in. They work with USCRI to determine which refugees USCRI will resettle, and then USCRI and us, we look together at which refugees make sense to be resettled in Vermont. We have to assure the case. So we look at the case beforehand, and we see if we have the capacity with all the services, housing, all the things that that family might need. And then if we assure it, then that means we're making our promise to the State Department to do the work. It could be a couple weeks, it could be months, it could be over a year from the time we assure a case until the refugees actually arrive. So we have no way of knowing when refugees will start arriving in Rutland. We don't have a crystal ball, because not only is part of the process dependent on the family and how quickly they go through the process, but it's also the capacity that the government has to process their applications. It takes between 2 or 3 years for people to go through the process of application to the U.S. The first step is they are applying to the UNHCR, that's the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, to get refugee status. Refugee status is based on whether or not they fear for their life because of a human-made problem. That's a paraphrase, but to just bring it back down to the basics, that's what's happening for people. The UNHCR will interview them, will do a screening process, and from there they may or may not be able to receive any services. The United States looks at the pool of people who have that refugee status and offers that pool the opportunity to come to the U.S. The whole process starts from scratch as far as the U.S. is concerned. They're not accepting anybody's word for anything. So they're starting their security screening. They are starting medical checkups and any kind of treatment people would need before they would come. They're interviewing again. Once again, people want to make sure that the people coming here are who they say they are, and they are, in fact, refugees deserving of our humanitarian aid. Once the refugees are in the process to come here, we get about 10 days notice before they're coming here. So the reason I'm late is because we got less than 10 days notice for 25 people coming. So we've been pretty busy. And then there was road construction, of course. We meet people at the airport. In Rutland, it'll be a little different. They will come from by ground transportation from an airport, probably in the New York area. But we meet them at the Burlington airport, usually in the middle of the night. We have 3 families arriving tonight. From there, everything moves very quickly. So the case manager has been preparing for the families to come. We have to have a place for them to live. We're looking for a place that is a market rate apartment. There's no special housing for refugees. We know we have they will have a very limited budget. They're running the apartment, we're not. Each individual coming will be receiving $925. That's the working capital they have. It does not go very far when you're looking at putting down a security deposit, first month's rent. They also are coming with a loan. They have to borrow the money to fly here. The U.S. program for refugee resettlement is unique to the U.S. It is a work program. So we start out right away saying, you've got to work, you've got to pay the money, this is not a handout. From the $925, we've been very fortunate in Vermont to successfully get some competitive grants that offer limited cash assistance at the poverty level for up to 8 months to support people as they are getting their feet on the ground, getting the kids in school, getting started in their English language classes, getting a medical checkup within 30 days, going to employment workshop, working on their resume, practicing their interview skills. The money that they receive has requirements with it. One of the most important requirements is they're expected to take the first entry-level job they're offered. You can imagine that that would be incredibly exciting if you've never had the opportunity to have a job. But if you've been a professional and now you're having to take a manual labor job, that's a challenge. So we're working with each individual, each family in a culturally sensitive way to help them understand what steps they're going to have to take to become self-sufficient in 3 to 6 months and begin a strong life here. The outcomes we've had for employment in the Burlington area, over 90% of people are self-sufficient in 6 months. So it's incredibly positive outcome. Employers in the Burlington area are able to stay there. Some companies were looking at moving or able to grow because they have a reliable workforce, including refugees. So that's something that we expect is going to be a huge contribution to the Rutland area. In terms of most of the programs that refugees benefit from to get off to a start, they're federally funded. There's very little money that comes from local organizations. Most of what's coming is coming in the form of donations of space, time, services, and Rutland so far is looking like it's going to be setting the standard pretty high of what they're able to offer to support new arrivals. Refugees are similar to other immigrants coming here. When they first come, they have dreams of what it is to be in the U.S., and then reality sets in. We are a very powerful, wealthy country where people have to work hard and contribute. So our roads are not paved with gold, and but our possibilities are tremendous. People do not know all the different careers they could possibly have, all the educational opportunities. So that's one of the ways that the community is able to, in a volunteer role, really expand people's long-term possibilities. Families are coming here for the benefit of their children. For most adults, most parents, they're not going to be able to get back on track where they left off. But they are coming here for their kids, and their kids are committed to the family. So that's what we're looking at to have happen here. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Good evening, folks. I am Chris Loris, and I'm the mayor of the city of Rutland. Question is, why Rutland? I didn't forget, or I wasn't able to bring a PowerPoint presentation because I don't do that. And I certainly certainly don't have the talent of these two women who spoke before me to put any images up there. So I'm going to ask you at the beginning here to conjure your own image as to why Rutland. I want to speak very briefly to the compassionate and humanitarian perspective that they set me up for. And just like I've got no talent to take pictures, I don't have a very rich imagination either, so I'm going to steal an idea, steal a story from a member of the Rutland City Board of Aldermen, Scott Tomla. So put yourself in this position. Pretend down here, Manchester, Dorset, the North Shire, that tomorrow your house is gone. It's gone. There are people all around you who at best don't care if you live or if you die, and they're possibly just outright trying to kill you. The only place you have safe refuge is up north in Plattsburgh, New York. You take all your worldly possessions, anything you can carry that's important to you, that you can carry. You might be wearing shoes, you might be wearing sandals, you might have no shoes at all. And you're going to take your possessions with you and sell everything else so you can pay somebody to get you to Plattsburgh. First step is to walk. Walk from here, 35 miles to Rutland, and you got to keep going, another 68 to Burlington. Just think about that for a sec. And then when you get up there to Burlington, you're going to get in a raft that's built for 30, and they're going to shove 70 on it, and you'll have possibly a life jacket that doesn't work, or no life jacket at all, and you don't know how to swim. And you've got to go across Lake Champlain in rough 2-foot waves to get to Plattsburgh to be safe. That's your situation. That's what's happening in Syria. That's what's been happening in Syria. So this is the right thing to do for Rutland, for the state, and for this country. Fortunately, there are a lot of people that didn't have to make that choice and make that travel. They sorry, I'm minimizing it. They didn't have to make the travel across the water, as you saw with the pictures. They were able to get across the border into Jordan, into a refugee camp of 80,000 people in 3 square miles. And that's their life. And the average time to spend in a refugee camp in the world is 17 years. So, that's the compassionate and humanitarian side. So why Rutland? Because I'm selfish. Rutland is a microcosm of the rest of the state, exclusive of Chittenden County. We've got a declining population, just like the rest of the state, a graying population. Rutland reached its peak in population at 19,000 people in 1970, has been declining since. Rutland is built on an immigrant population. The boom that Rutland saw in the late 1800s and early 1900s was driven by people who weren't from around here. They're driven by new Americans. That's what our Rutland's identity is based on. That's the very nature of our being. And as homogenous as Rutland is, any level of cultural diversity we have is attributed to the Southern and Eastern Europeans that came to Rutland at the turn of the century. The Sicilians, the Italians, the Poles, the Russians, the Jewish community, and the Greeks. A few others in between. But that's what built Rutland. That was our past, and though we don't dwell on the past, it leads us to our future. As I said, we had 19,000 people in 1970. Right now, 16,495 in Tank-and-Quick. Just like many other communities in the state, we have a population problem that we need to work to reverse. We have still, though we have 16,500 people, we still have the housing stock for 19,000 people. We can accept new Americans readily. We can provide, this is VRP's language, which I've adopted. I trust the subject matter experts. We have the safe and secure housing, safe and sanitary housing. And it's affordable housing, and we have it in the quantities that are needed. We have the capacity to accept 100 Syrians in 12-month period, 25 families, 25 to 30 families over the course of 12 months. So for the city to embrace these new Americans, it will stabilize our neighborhoods and provide a level of cultural diversity that we haven't seen in over 100 years. And that cultural diversity, frankly, any study will tell you if you drill into it like I have. As far as the graying population is concerned, young Vermonters that want to stay here, young folks from away that want to move to Vermont, they want to live in a culturally rich environment. And that's what we will recognize in Rutland with this influx of Syrian refugees. Jobs. There are 3 areas of capacity. Sorry, I didn't piggyback enough on Lori. 3 areas of capacity that Lori mentioned when they were assessing Rutland and assessing other communities in the state. ELL, English language learning, jobs, especially entry-level jobs, so people who have lived rich lives and full lives can integrate into the workforce while they build their English language skills, and that safe and sanitary housing. The jobs capacity in Rutland is far and away above what is needed to support refugee resettlement. We, like the rest of the state, have an unhealthy level of unemployment. It's approaching 4%. Anything less than, I think, 5.1%, the economists will tell you, is an unhealthy level of unemployment, and we're well below that. Since the announcement, building on the research that was done before the announcement, since that announcement, we have had employer after employer after employer calling my office, reaching out to Rutland Economic Development Corporation and the Chamber saying, we need employees. We can't build our business. We can't get more throughput. We can't increase our revenue. Can't pay more taxes without employees. And Rutland, as I said, is a microcosm of the rest of the state. We need people who are driven to work, who will enter the workforce driven to succeed, and we have that jobs capacity to bring them in. And we will recognize significant economic benefits, and it's been proven in city after city after city that has embraced refugee resettlement. As large as Cleveland, where a 10-to-1 ratio of return on investment of federal and state tax dollars returns tenfold into the community. So 2012 economic study for Cleveland, 4.8 million of state and federal funds to support refugee resettlement returned 48 million into the city. We will recognize those same benefits in Rutland. They've seen it in Lewiston, Maine, similar demographic to Rutland. Likewise, Utica, New York, similar demographic to Rutland. And of course, Winooski especially. I don't want to talk about Burlington. Burlington, they're their own cats, different animal. But we can look at Winooski and look at the successes of Winooski and replicate that in Rutland. So I could speak at great length, but we want to move this along for question and answer. But the bottom line is, for the city of Rutland, we recognize beyond the compassionate and humanitarian side that there is not a vibrant, growing, and successful community in the country that has not embraced new Americans, whether they're refugees or whether they're immigrants. Likewise. I'm going to speak to one more thing before I go. You'll probably hear me if you ask me questions going on. I'll be dispelling a lot of false narratives about the city of Rutland. One thing that people hold up, and I know you folks read newspapers and listen to radio. Rutland, like the rest of New England, like the rest of the country now, because we saw it during and have seen it during the presidential campaign, is and has been struggling with the deleterious effects of opiate addiction. But Rutland recognized it before anyone else recognized it in the state. And we have, because there are people saying we need to take care of our own problems first. Well, we've done that. I just want to address it. Through an organization called Project Vision over the last 2 years, we've driven down burglaries in the city of Rutland by 60%, driven down thefts and shoplifting by 50%, driven down disorderly conducts by 30%, and driven down the number of children born to opiate-addicted mothers by 40%. And we have, working with our partners in academia, specifically David Kennedy out of John Jay College of Criminal Justice at the City University of New York, have developed a national model that we're being hauled around the country and to discuss, as well as around the state of Vermont. So when you hear false narratives about Rutland, don't believe them. And I can talk to those all night long as well, but I do want to focus on refugee resettlement and the great things that'll do for my community, and how we need to play a role on the global stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Louros. Thank you, all panelists, for absolutely fascinating presentations. Each building on the one before. I think we owe them a big round of applause. Thank you all very much for coming.